Okay, colleagues, and hopefully we're back, and let us continue our reading of the wonderful, the one and only Hobbes's Leviathan. Um, um, so just to be clear, I have uploaded this file that I am reading from to our Microsoft Teams folder, so you can double check it there. You can access it there. So anyway, the next section is a super important section in all sorts of ways. We have a whole separate class of questions on the exam devoted just to this, the laws of nature, right? So, and we're going to see this a continuation of Hobbes's anti-Aristotelianism. So Hobbes versus Aristotle. Again, this notion that there is no natural morality. There is no natural concepts of good and evil, and we will see this immediately. Now, Taylor and Warrender are going to dispute this. This is going to be the basic point of contention with Taylor and Warrender, because they would say no, actually, so except for Taylor Warrender. But the standard interpretations of Hobbes is that no, actually, there's no such thing as morality. And we're gonna see this immediately starting. And again, Hobbes kept saying this over and over and over again. He says human beings are not evil. In war, everything is permitted. By nature, nothing is good or evil, right? Again, this idea, force and fraud are in war, two cardinal virtues. Force and fraud are in war, two cardinal virtues. Right? But let's continue. Yeah. So and we see this immediately. We see how rights are more important than duties, right? Rights come before duties, right? And we have this, we're going to talk about this right of nature. The right of nature, jus naturale, is the liberty each man has to use his own power. So this is the right of nature, right? The liberty that each man has to use his own power for the preservation of his own nature, and consequently of doing anything which in his judgment is the best means thereunto. And notice, this is the freedom of the sovereign. Freedom of the sovereign. Because the sovereign does not sign the contract. The sovereign does not sign. The sovereign is under no obligation. And therefore, the sovereign can do anything according to the right of nature. Now, of course, and we're going to keep seeing this over and over and over again, right? So Hobbes says that, of course, you do things for your own preservation, but it's like, who are you responsible to? Well, are you responsible to God? Again, in my interpretation, I would say no, because God is incomprehensible, really. So practically, even if Hobbes uses the word responsible to God, practically this means responsible to no one. Okay? And when I say so I mean the sovereign is responsible to no one, or like in general, people in the state of nature are responsible to no one. Let's continue. Yeah. So So by liberty, absence of external impediments. So this is if you're interested, this is basically Hobbes is a determinist. Hobbes is a determinist. There's no real free will. No real free will. We are determined. We are mechanically determined by passions. But Hobbes is also a compatibilist in the sense that for a compatibilist, to be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes. To be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes. Whatever you consider to be right causes, right? And so specifically, if you want these internal, small beginnings of voluntary emotion, so internal causes, like normal psychological causes, etc. Yeah, so this is the right of nature. The law of nature, again, these are all super important concepts. I hope everybody's taking note. Precept, or a general rule, found out by reason. Again, notice, not revelation. But reason. We know this not from the prophets, not from the government, but by the light of reason. By the light of reason. By which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life or takes away the means of preserving the same. This is going to be important because or omit that by which he thinks it might be best preserved. Now, this is going to be important because a covenant to not defend myself from force is automatically void. This is why. Oops. This is why it's important. A covenant not to defend myself is automatically void. Because well, you say reason, is this really a law? Is this really a law? So many commentators, like Klosko, for example, George Klosko says, well, it's like, this isn't really a law of nature. Hobbes is using rhetoric of the law of nature against the law of nature thinking. So rhetoric of the laws of nature against the natural law tradition. So he's being, according to Klosko, Hobbes is being specifically, on purposefully subversive, right? And so natural law tradition of, for example, people like Aquinas or Cicero, I think, right? Because, again, we aren't really talking about real laws. We are simply talking about, again, general precepts. Let's even double underline this. A precept or a general rule found out by reason. So it's like a theorem. So it's a good idea. Like, you shouldn't drink bleach. Why not? Because you'll die. Let's suppose I don't care about dying. Well, you should care about dying, Hobbes is going to say. And people who don't care about dying are not alive, presumably. Anyway, let's continue. Yeah. So I'm not sure if this passage is important. Obligation and liberty. Honestly, I'm not sure if this is important. So let's skip this. Anyway, and because a condition of man, as has been declared in the preceding chapter, is a condition of war, so the natural condition of man is a condition of war, of every man against every man. In this case, everyone is governed by his own reason. And there is nothing that he can make use of that not be helped unto him to preserve his life against enemies, right? So it follows that in such a condition, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. Every man has a right to, so which the corollary, and even to another's body, right? The corollary is that nobody has a particular right to anything, particular right to anything, right? And we talked about this, how property is unnatural. Property is unnatural or artificial. We talked about this before. Well, and artificial, it depends on the will of the sovereign, depends on the free grant by the sovereign. And so the sovereign gives, and the sovereign therefore can take away. And so we have this, every man has a right to everything, and even we have the right to kill each other, even the right to one another's body. Right? Yes. And therefore, so long as this natural right of every man to everything endures, there can be no security, no matter how strong or how wise you are. And consequently, it is a precept or a general rule of reason, and this is going to be our first law of nature. First law, right? And consequently, it is a precept or a general rule that every man ought to endeavor for peace as far as he has hope to obtaining it. But when you cannot obtain it, you may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. So notice, we make peace according to the laws of nature. But we also go to war, according to the laws of nature. So the laws of nature direct us to endeavor peace, to try to establish peace. But when we cannot establish peace, the laws of nature direct us to use all helps and advantages of war. Okay? Okay, this is important, right? So we fight in the state of nature according to the laws of nature, but we also make the social contract according to the laws of nature. Okay? 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 I hope we're clear. It's an important point. Yeah, the first branch contains the fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. The second is the sum of the right of nature, by which, by all means, we can defend ourselves. So, and basically, like the most important idea is that we must protect ourselves. We must protect ourselves. And what is the best way to do this? So, if peace protects us best, then we need to seek peace, right? Peace to protect ourselves, and also make war. If peace is impossible, but if impossible, we make war to protect ourselves. Again, to protect ourselves. Yeah. So this is the first law of nature. So then we have the second law of nature, and that a man should be willing, when others are so too, to lay down his right to all things and be contented with so much liberty as he would allow other men against himself. Right? So this is the second law. And notice that reciprocity is there from the very beginning. So the first law is founded on reciprocity, and the second law is also founded on reciprocity. So by reciprocity, I mean, so reciprocity is super important. And the idea of reciprocity is that if there's a guarantee that other people will keep the peace, you should keep peace. If you are laying down the rights, you lay down the rights. Again, you are contented with so much liberty against other men as you would allow other man against himself. Right. So this again is golden rule or silver rule, golden or silver rule. Hobbes uses both formulations in this chapter. Anyway, yeah. So whatsoever you require that others should do, you do to them. Quod tibi fieri non vis alteri ne feceris. So this is the golden rule right here, and this is the silver rule. And Hobbes uses both formulations in the same paragraph, basically, one after another. Yeah, so you lay down the right, you renounce, you pass away, the right passes away. Okay, I wonder what is important here. Transferring of right. Anyway, I'm not sure if we need to talk about this in detail. So, okay, so we talk about renouncing of right, or we talk about transferring of right. He renounces the right where he cares not to whom the benefit redounds. By transferring, he intends the benefit to some certain person. So this is clearly going to be important when we talk about a contract, right? When a man has either abandoned or granted away his right, then he is said to be obliged or bound not to hinder those to whom such right is granted. So again, this is going to be the obligation. This is going to be the basis of an obligation to the sovereign. Yeah. So you have a duty to not make void, and that such hindrance is injustice or injury. So the contract may become void, but we'll talk about that. But in principle, Yeah, well, actually, this is going to be the next section. The next section is going to be super important, that there are certain, again, this is going to be condition of the contract being void, and this is like, you see, the sovereign does not sign a contract. This is important. The sovereign does not sign a contract. Therefore, it is impossible to keep any rights against the sovereign. Impossible to have rights, to have or to reserve, if you want to reserve rights against the sovereign, because the sovereign is not bound by anything. The sovereign has a right to all things, so to do absolutely whatever, right? However, there are conditions, but there are conditions under which the contract becomes void. And this is exactly what we're talking about here. Not all rights are alienable. Some rights, so it's like on the contract, if you want, you give up all your rights. But the problem is that there are some rights that you cannot, in principle, give up. And so this is what we're going to talk about in a second, right? So when a man transfers his right or renounces it, this is for some good, for the sake of reciprocity or for some good. Transferring of right is a voluntary act. And any voluntary act, the object must be some good to himself, right? So since transferring of right is a voluntary act, the object must be some good. If the object is not, if there is no good that redounds to a man, then the contract becomes void. So let me write, or void. There must be some good to you, or the contract is void. Therefore, there be some rights which no man can be understood by any words or any signs to have abandoned or transferred. So some rights it is in principle impossible to abandon, even if you say the right words. At first, a man cannot lay down his right of resisting them that assault him by force or take away his life, because he cannot be understood to aim thereby at any good to himself. The same may be said of wounds, chains, and imprisonment. So let's exercise some common sense here, right? So when we talk about wounds, chains, and imprisonment, we mean like medieval kinds of wounds, chains, and imprisonment. So I would imagine that contemporary prisons probably do not make the contract void. So, but we are talking, so like not all prisons are equal, right? So we're probably not talking about modern prisons, right? So, but what is important is that we're talking about a reasonable expectation of your safety, if you want. So if you can reasonably expect to be safe in a modern prison, then the contract is not void. This is what I would say. Anyway, also because a man cannot tell when he sees men proceed against him with violence whether they intend his death or not, right? So again, this notion that, again, in medieval prisons, basically, you had no guarantee of safety, no reasonable expectation or guarantee of safety. Anyway, yeah. So ultimately, the purpose of all our actions is the security of man's person, your life, means of preserving life, as not to be wary of it. Life as not to be wary of it. So if I am alive, but I am constantly being tortured, this is no life at all. So compare. So for example, constant torture, means that it's life. I'm wary of life, which means I want to die, right? So anyway, and therefore, if a man by words or other signs seems to despoil himself of the end for which those signs were intended, he is not to be understood as if he meant it, or that it was his will, but that he was ignorant of how such words and actions were to be interpreted. So if you say that I agree to not defend myself from force, I agree to not defend myself from violence, we should interpret this as if you do not understand the words of English language. That you simply, you're a foreigner, you do not understand the words of English. Or maybe you are mad. Also, let me say, right? So life is not to be wary of it. And this is again, remember, Hobbes, supposedly, he begins the Leviathan by comparing too much liberty with too much authority. So too much liberty, it's a middle way between the two. Middle way between too much liberty and too much authority, right? And this is what he says, right? So there are conditions when contract becomes void. Now, this notion of contract becoming void, right? This is a liberal element in Hobbes, and you can compare this to the contrast this. So Hobbes versus the divine right of kings. So somebody like Filmer probably would say that, according to the divine right of kings, the king has the right to kill you, and you cannot do anything about it. The contract is not void. We're not talking about social contract, right? If the king orders you to die, you die, right? So like the divine right of kings would say, at worst you accept martyr's death. Accept martyr's death. Принять мученическую смерть, right? And this is the basis, right, for calling Hobbes a social contract theorist. Social contract, right? This idea that the legitimacy of the government is derived from the consent of the governed. Is derived from the consent of the governed, and specifically that there is some kind of benefit to the subjects, right? So, and the idea is that even in the worst tyranny, even you're still, even the worst tyranny is better than anarchy. Is better than anarchy, or this war of all against all, right? In a sense that at least your life is protected. At least your life is protected. Of course, if your life is not protected, then we're not talking about tyranny, then the contract is void. Otherwise, the contract is void. The contract becomes void. Okay. So he says the mutual transferring of right is what men call contract. So some students sometimes ask me, is it appropriate to talk about social contract for Hobbes? The answer is yes. Contract is a mutual transferring of right. So covenant or contract, it's the same. So social contract is a valid word. Social contract or covenant. So, but what I'm driving at is the word contract is a word that Hobbes himself uses here. You see it. Anyway, yeah. So I think we can skip this stuff. Well, Hobbes talks about this, how contract can be expressed or inferred. So you can have an implied contract if you want. Right? So the idea of tacit consent, tacit or implicit consent. So this is going to be important down the line. We'll talk about this later on. Yeah, I think we can skip this stuff. Yeah. So let's proceed. If a covenant be made where neither of the parties perform presently, but trust one another. Neither of the parties perform presently, but trust one another. In the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war, Upon any reasonable suspicion, the contract is void. And again, this phrase that the contract is void, this is also from Hobbes. Upon any reasonable suspicion, the contract is void. But if there's a common power with right and force sufficient to compel performance, so this is expectation, punishment, threat of punishment. Then it is not void, right? And Hobbes says, for he who promises first has no assurance that the other will perform, because the bond of words are too weak, and other passions without the fear. So again, I talked about threat of punishment. So we talk about fear of some coercive power, But there is no fear of the coercive power in the condition of mere nature, where all men are equal. Judges of the justness of their own fears cannot possibly be supposed. And therefore he who performs first does but betray himself to his enemy, contrary to the right he can never abandon of defending his life or the means of living. Again, the point is that keeping covenants in the state of nature is against the reason of self-preservation, is against the reason of self-preservation, is self-destruction, right? And therefore against the laws of nature, right? Well, again, we have to be careful, because he talks about where neither of the parties perform presently. So presumably, immediate exchange is possible and lawful in the state of nature. So, and this is maybe how you make the social contract in the first place. If there's, again, a covenant, Hobbes says, if a covenant where neither of the parties perform presently, this is void. But if both parties perform presently, immediately, right, then the contract is not void, and this is maybe how you first establish the social contract. So this is the first mover, the solution to the first mover problem. Okay. Yes. But in a civil state, there's power to constrain. Fear is reasonable, right? And therefore, covenants. You have to keep covenants in the civil state, in civil society. Yeah. But notice that fear is the condition of performance, right? Fear is a condition of validity of covenants. So in some sense, only the covenants which are made in fear of punishment for non-performance, only those are valid. Yeah, so let's skip this. So no covenants with beasts, no covenants with God. Yeah, okay, let's skip this stuff. So Hobbes says covenants entered into by fear are obligatory, even in the condition of mere nature. So this is important. So, and we talked about this, right? So already, fear is a condition of validity of covenants. And again, Hobbes gives this example. So even if in the condition of the state of nature, I covenant to pay a ransom for the service of my life to an enemy, I am bound by it. It is a contract. One receives the benefit of life. The other is to receive money. And consequently, where no law, as in the condition of mere nature, forbids the performance, covenant is valid. Therefore, prisoners of war, if trusted with payment of the ransom, are obliged to pay it. And if a weaker prince makes disadvantageous peace with a stronger, for fear, he is bound to keep it. Unless, as has been said before, there arises some new just cause of fear to renew the war. So international relations, this is your stuff, colleagues. And even in commonwealths, again, it's interesting. Even in commonwealths, if I am forced to redeem myself from a thief by promising his money, I am bound to pay it. So even in society, if a thief forces me to promise his money, I am bound to pay it until the civil law discharge me. So I have, if a thief tells me, your money or your life, I am promised to pay, and I am not at liberty to break the covenant until the sovereign absolves me from it, discharges me from my promise. Now, again, for Hobbes, all this is important, is because fear is the condition of the validity of covenants, and covenants are always made from fear, in fact. So all lawful, all valid covenants rest on fear. Fear of the sovereign, especially fear of the sovereign, of the punishment by the sovereign. Yeah. Yeah, so let's continue. So a covenant not to defend myself from force is always void. And again, this is indeed a liberal part of Hobbes. This is indeed a liberal notion in Hobbes. That again, well, we have talked about this, right? And no man can transfer or lay down his right to save himself from death, wounds, and imprisonment. And in fact, Hobbes talks about this elsewhere. Maybe we're also talking about children, parents, and like significant, important figures. He talks about benefactors. So if the sovereign is endangering not just your life, but life of people who are close to you, this is also a cause for the covenant being void. Now, the fact that in principle the sovereign is assaulting someone else, that does not make the covenant void. But if the sovereign is assaulting someone else, and this gives you a reasonable expectation that your life is also going to be in danger, then the contract may also become void. We'll talk about this later, but again, some readers of Hobbes actually called Hobbes a rebel, and called the Leviathan rebel's catechism. So let me again go back to this. Again, the legitimacy of the government is based on the consent of the governed, right? And so, from the standpoint of hardcore divine right of kings, defenders of the divine right of kings, Leviathan. There was a particular person, historical person, you can look this up, called Leviathan Rebel's Catechism. Rebel's Catechism. So, like manifesto of revolutionaries, if you want. Revolutionary manifesto, right? This was the accusation leveled against Hobbes for precisely these phrases. That the contract becomes void if you are afraid for your life, right? Because the classical divine right of kings position was no, you should die martyr's death. So this is an important liberal element in Hobbes. Yeah. So Hobbes says that you can say, unless I do so and so, kill me, but you cannot say, unless I do so and so, I will not resist you. Right? So you are always entitled to resist assaults on your life. Again, because again, and we talk about this deaths, wounds, and imprisonment, because he says avoiding death, wound, and imprisonment is the only end of laying down any right. So this is because this is the basis of the social contract. So in many ways, what goes on in this situation, if I could go back to my idea, is that like, in some sense, every moment, you ask yourself, is the contract void? In many ways, it's like am I being protected? Am I being protected? And when I say am I being protected, in a sense of, do I have a reasonable expectation that I am being protected, right? So it's like, it's a like background task that runs in your mind, and you constantly keep asking yourself this question. And this is, again, the liberal element in Hobbes. Yeah, and Hobbes says that even when you lead criminals to execution, you have to guard them with armed men, because there's like, it is against the law of nature for these people, for criminals who are condemned to die. There's no according to the law of nature, they have the right to try to save themselves by any means necessary. So it is necessary to have armed guards as you are leading criminals to be executed. That's the general idea. So again, no man is obliged to accuse himself. A covenant to accuse oneself without the assurance of pardon is likewise invalid. Yeah. So again, you can see these fairly liberal elements in Hobbes. Yeah. So, and the same is also true for the accusation of those by whose condemnation a man falls into misery. Life is not to be weary of it, right? Life is not to be weary of it, right? For example, a father, a wife, or a benefactor. You see? We talked about this. So, okay, yeah, also Hobbes talks about these accusations upon torture are not to be taken as testimony. Again, yeah, this is all hopefully fairly clear. Yeah, so the force of words are too weak to hold men to the performance of the covenants. There are two imaginable helps to strengthen it. Two imaginable helps to strengthen it. So either a fear of the consequence of breaking the words, or a glory or pride. Again, you see, Hobbes says that human beings are appetitive. So it's either fear or glory. So two imaginable. So people keep covenants out of fear of punishment for non-performance, or out of glory or pride in appearing not to need to break it. But this latter is a generosity too rarely found to be presumed on. We cannot presume. Some people will keep their word just out of pride, but it happens too rarely to count on this. So therefore, the passion to be reckoned upon is fear. And he talks about how fear can be fear of the spirits invisible, and this is this secular role of religion, if you want, secular function of religion, and the other, power of those men they shall offend. Of these two, the former be the greater power, yet the fear of the latter is commonly the greater fear. So, but especially fear of men. The fear of ghosts, of spirits invisible, is every man's religion. before the, so this takes place before the civil society. Okay, yeah, we can skip this. Anyway. Yeah. So let's continue our discussion, right? So we talk about other laws of nature, and so we're gonna it's gonna be important problems. Specifically, we're gonna talk about the fool's problem in a second, right? So we talked about two laws of nature. The first one was to seek peace and follow it, and the second was to lay down your right to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men, as this reciprocal obligation of golden rule or silver rule requires. So now we have a third law of nature, which is that man must perform the covenants made. So we had first law, second law, and now we have a third law. Men must perform the covenants made, without which covenants are in vain, but empty words, and the right of all men to all things remaining, we are still in the conditions of war, right? And Hobbes talks about how the performance of covenant is justice, and the non-performance is injustice. And Hobbes is going to say that whatever is not unjust is just. Whatever is not unjust is just. So this may be, if you want, negative formulation of freedom. Yeah. Yeah, so again, so Hobbes talks about how before the names of just and unjust can have place, there must be some coercive power. Covenants without the sword are but words, right? Which compel men equally to the performance of their covenants by terror of some punishment. Greater, and the punishment should be greater than the benefit that they expect by the breach of their covenant. Yeah. And again, Hobbes repeats that when there is no commonwealth, then nothing is unjust. So that the nature of justice consists in keeping of valid covenants, but the validity of covenants begins not with the constitution of the civil power, but begins only with the constitution of the civil power sufficient to compel men to keep them. And this is where also property, rules of property begin. Yeah, okay. So finally we get to the fool's problem. Okay. So this is going to potentially could be difficult, and I think last time we discussed this, we spent several hours trying to unpack it. So, but let's see how much progress we can make. So the fool is somebody who thinks that there's no such thing as justice, right? And who thinks he can break the covenant with impunity. So again, this is a problem, and it's not exactly sure what Hobbes' resolution is. One of our home assignments actually talks about how Hobbes doesn't really solve the problem as much as he just engages in some wishful thinking. Anyway, so the fool had said in his heart, "There is no God." Right? This is a famous quote from the Bible. The fool said in his heart, "There is no such thing as justice," and sometimes also with his tongue, seriously alleging that every man's conservation and contentment being committed to his own care, there could be no reason why every man might not do what he thought conduced, to his own preservation, and therefore also to make or not to make, to keep or not keep covenants was not against reason when it conduced to one's benefit. The fool does not deny that there are covenants, and the fool does not deny that they are sometimes broken, sometimes kept, and that the breach of them may be called injustice. The breach of covenants may be called injustice, and the observance of covenants is called justice. But the fool, questions whether injustice taking away the fear of God, for the same fool had said in his heart that there is no God. So the fool said in his heart that there is no God, so he doesn't care about God. And we know from Hobbes that God is incomprehensible, so what's to stop the fool, right? So fool asks a question. Maybe injustice may sometimes stand with reason, which dictates to every man his own good. And particularly when it conduces to such a benefit as shall put a man in a condition to neglect, so to not care about, to neglect, to not care about, not care about, not be afraid of, not only the dispraise, but also the power of other men. So let's take stock. So the fool breaks the covenant. For personal benefit. Dictates to his man his own good, right? So for own benefit. And does so and ends up in such a position that he doesn't care, he's not afraid of, and as a result, he is in a condition to not care about the opinions or power of other men, because maybe the fool is too strong, or maybe because no one finds out. Right? So this is my natural interpretation of what Hobbes is trying to say here. Right? Okay, so it's a bit of an obscure passage. He talks about how the kingdom of God is gotten by violence. It's not clear exactly what Hobbes is alluding to here. What if it could be gotten by unjust violence? Word against reason to so get it when it's impossible to receive hurt by it. So it's very strange. So he's talking about going to paradise through unjust violence. So achieving paradise, entering paradise through unjust violence. Very strange. And Hobbes says, if it's not against reason, then it's not against justice. You see again, he says, impossible. Again, were it so against reason, when it's impossible to receive hurt by it. You see? He sets this up in very grave terms. He says, and if it's not against reason, then it's not against justice. Or else justice is not a good thing. So let's compare this to the Ring of Gyges from Plato. Plato on the Ring of Gyges, right? This idea that you have a ring of invisibility, such that you can commit injustice with impunity, right? And Hobbes says, from such reasoning, successful wickedness has obtained the name of virtue. Notice, successful wickedness. So when he talks about this violation of faith, allowed it when it's for the forgetting of a kingdom. So this is, he talks about, again, here he talks about religious fanatics. Religious fanatics, or like religious rebels. Let's write the word fanatics, which is a big concern of Hobbes. He thinks this is a big threat for peace, right? So people, we understand, right? So violation of faith for the getting of kingdom. So basically, we're talking about people, let's say Catholics in a Protestant domain or Protestants in the Catholic domain, who think that they are no longer under the obligation to their king for religious reasons. So people who believe that religion trumps political obligation. And people who disobey, or I should say rebel against the king, the lawful king, well, let's just say against the king, for the sake of heaven, paradise, right? So we are basically talking about wars of religion, and specifically we're talking about the 30 Years' War. So this is what these are the stakes that Hobbes is playing for here. Anyway, and so skipping some things, right? So now Hobbes is going to set up this example. He says, imagine the prince, right heir to the crown, again, an heir apparent of a kingdom, so the prince, shall kill the king, though his father, right? So the prince kills the king, his father. And again, as we see here, and eo instante, that second, and that second, that moment becomes the king himself. And therefore, therefore innocent, right? And pardons himself. Right? So this is the example that Hobbes gives. And again, like, so in a condition not to care about the opinions and power of other men. So again, a very stark, a very grave formulation. And Hobbes says, you may call it injustice, or by what other name you want, yet it can never be against reason, seeing all voluntary actions of men tend to the benefit of themselves. So again, you may call it injustice, it's never against reason. All voluntary acts tend to the benefit of themselves, and those actions are most reasonable that conduce most to their ends. Right? And Hobbes says, this specious reasoning is nevertheless false. Right? So this reasoning is false. And again, we have seen in the article by Deborah Baumgold from Boucher and Kelly, that maybe Hobbes is this just wishful thinking on the part of Hobbes? Does he simply ignore? I mean, can he? Because he's playing for very high stakes. He's saying, look, I am in a condition to completely not care about the consequences. Again, tremendous stakes. Anyway, and Hobbes tries to argue against this, but I want to say that the arguments are fairly weak. Hobbes says, the question is not of promises mutual, where there's no security, but either when one of the parties has performed already, right? So basically, again, he talks about the situation in the state of nature, right? I talked about this. We talked about this with respect to apples and oranges. So like, imagine in the state. So he gives another example. So in the state of nature, in the condition of mere nature, we have an immediate covenant, contract, or covenant. I don't know. Immediate. Covenant. And more specifically, he says, let's say one party performed already. So like we immediate covenant to trade, let's say apples for oranges. And you already gave me apples. You already gave me apples. The question is, should I give you oranges or run away with both? And Hobbes says, I say it is not against reason. He says it is not against reason to basically, let's be very clear. It's not against reason for me to give you oranges, right? And not run away. Because basically, if I run away, with both apples and oranges, I tend to my own destruction. Right? So I should say, the prince who kills the king tends to his own destruction. This is what Hobbes is saying, right? Tends to his own destruction. Again, howsoever some accident which he could not expect will turn to his benefit. Yet such events do not make it reasonably or wisely done. Well, again, the fact that I become a king and I'm now safe, is this really an accident? Well, it's hard to say, right? But then Hobbes continues. He says that in a condition of war where every man is an enemy to every man, there is no common power to keep us all in awe. No man can hope by his own strength to defend himself from destruction without the help of confederates. No man can hope by his own strength to defend himself, right? And where everyone expects the same defense by the confederation, and therefore he that declares he thinks it reason to deceive those that help him, right, can in reason expect no other means of safety than what he has from his own single power. He therefore that breaks his covenant and consequently declares that he may break his covenant with reason, right, cannot be received into any society that unite themselves for peace and defense, but by the error of them that receive him. Nor, when he's received, be retained in it without seeing the danger of this error, which, because it's an error, a man cannot reasonably rely upon as a means of his safety. And therefore, if he be left or cast out of society, he dies, he perishes. And if he lives in society, it is by the errors of other men, which he could not foresee, nor reckon upon, and consequently against the reason of his self-preservation. And so, all men that contribute not to his destruction forbear him only out of the ignorance of what is good for themselves. So let's rephrase this. So the prince is retained. The regicidal prince, who becomes the king, is retained in society only by the error of other men. And this is an error on which the prince should not count. And likewise, if I run away with both apples and oranges, right? Again, we imagine this silly contract in the state of nature. So a fool who runs away, right? Eloper, right? Eloper with apples and oranges. Apples and oranges cannot be accepted into society only by the error of other people, an error on which the eloper, runner away, right, thief, should not count on. That's the point. This is what Hobbes is saying. So again, is this an airtight argument? Probably not. But the idea that Hobbes is expressing here, I think, is clear. And the idea, I think, is very simple. The idea is, don't gamble with your life. Don't gamble with your life for the sake of trifles. For the sake of trifles, right? It's like, you're a prince. You are already being protected. So prince, listen, you are already protected. You are already protected. Don't push it. Don't push your luck, right? Maybe, eo instante, you will become the king and pardon yourself, but it's dangerous. You shouldn't do it. What are you going to get? What are you going to gain by this? There is nothing to be gained. Nothing important is to be gained by injustice. Nothing of real value is to be gained by injustice. Should we compare this to maybe Epicurus or David Hume? Again, this Hume talks about worthless toys and gewgaws or whatever. Worthless. But let's continue, because we talked about, basically we have three examples. We have the prince, the eloper, but we also have the religious fanatic. Let's talk about the religious fanatic. And Hobbes continues, he says, and as for the instance of gaining the secure and perpetual felicity of heaven, by any way, it is frivolous, there being only one way imaginable. It's not breaking, but keeping of covenant. And I would imagine that this is the phrase that Warrender latches onto. Right? That we go to heaven by keeping covenants, which is what Hobbes is saying here. And he says, other instances of attaining sovereignty by rebellion, it's manifest that even though the event follow, because it cannot reasonably be expected, but the contrary, and because by gaining it so, others are taught to gain the same in the like manner, the attempt thereof is against reason. Justice, therefore, is a rule of reason by which we are forbidden to do anything destructive of our life, and consequently a law of nature. Right? So let's unpack this. Hobbes is saying that rebellion is foolish foolish self-destruction because, for two reasons. Because A, you should not expect to succeed. And B, even if you succeed, you are teaching others a dangerous lesson. Right? And we can maybe even go back to this example of the prince, right? You know, if the prince killed the king, how will the prince be able to, look his servants in the eye? How will the prince be able to look his children in the eye? How will you be able to sleep at night? In a sense, and again, in a sense of safety, right? His, this regicidal prince, right? How will he interact with his own children? What will prevent his own children being taught by his example, killing him as well? Again, I want to stress, this is not airtight. This is not bulletproof. Because you could say, well, you know what? I'm pretty sure, I have a reasonable expectation that nobody will find out. But I think Hobbes, the only thing that Hobbes can say, look, worthless toys. Like the only reply is, don't gamble with your life for worthless toys. For the sake of worthless toys. So, and Hobbes continues talking about the religious fanatics. Once again, there were some, so religious fanatics that proceed further. So again, we are talking about, again, wars of religion, right? Consequently, feel that may be just and reasonable, merit or kill or depose or rebel against sovereign power constituted over them by their own consent. So kill or depose the king for religious reasons. But and Hobbes is going to come back. You should expect this coming. He says there's no natural knowledge of man's estate after death. No natural knowledge of man's estate after death. We do not know what's going to happen to us after we die. Right? Much less of the reward that is to be given to the breach of faith. Hobbes says, but there's only a belief grounded upon other men saying that they know it supernaturally, or that they know those. I knew a guy who knew this guy who knew this guy. They know those that knew them, that knew others, that knew it supernaturally. You see? Hobbes takes a jab at religious institutions, right? Religious authority. This is Hobbes against all religious authority. Because all religious authority is founded upon people who refer to other people, who refer to yet other people, who refer to, let's say, saints who have spoken to Jesus, who supposedly knows us supernaturally. So there's this very precarious chain, right? And trusting a guy who knew this guy, who knew this guy, who knew this guy, is a breach of faith, cannot be called a precept of reason, right? So, and remember that people may lie, people make mistakes and lie, or lie. Therefore, religious fanatics are not to be trusted. Okay, so he talks about heretics. I wanna skip this because there's a lot going on. So basically, Hobbes is gonna continue for quite a bit, and I want to mostly skip all of this. And get to the gist of the argument about the laws of nature. Okay, so as I am skipping all of this, take a note. So Hobbes is basically saying that upon reciprocity, if there's reciprocity, there are certain things it is a good idea to do, right? For example, gratitude, right? He says mutual accommodation or complacence. Then this facility to pardon, if people are asking for pardon. That you should forgive revenges. Contumely. So contumely, I think, is rashness and anger. So against pride, against arrogance, against equity. Again, use of things in common. So distribution by lot, жребий, primogeniture, or the right of first occupant. Mediators, submission to arbitration, that no man is his own judge, right? Bearing witnesses, again, against partiality, right? So we have this 19 laws of nature. We have these 19 laws of nature. And these are all basically, they are subject to reciprocity, always. So on the condition of reciprocity. And basically, what are they? What are they? They are convenient articles of peace. They are, if you want, good ideas. So laws of nature are good ideas that lead to peace, right? And so, in some sense, do you have to submit to arbitration? Do you have to forgive people? Do you have to be impartial? And the answer is, in general, it is a good idea to do so in the condition of reciprocity. So, in general, it is a do you have to forgive, be sociable, be impartial, submit to arbitration, etc. Right? And Hobbes is going to say, in general, it is a good idea for the sake of your own self-preservation. So this may be taken as a respectful advice to monarchs. So in this sense, you have to understand, right? The laws of nature are general laws. So they laws of nature apply to monarchs, to sovereigns as well. However, because the laws of nature apply to everyone, including sovereigns. But of course, since there's nobody above the sovereign, right? But since the sovereigns are supreme, since sovereigns are supreme, then strictly speaking, the sovereign, him or her or itself, is the only judge. The sovereign is the judge of how well she or it performs, adheres to, follows to the laws of nature. So you could say that there's an obligation to God, as Taylor and Warrender are going to say, but the sovereign, herself or itself, the sovereign, her or itself, is the judge of her or its obligation to God. So you could say, is the sovereign bound by the law of nature? Or does the sovereign have a duty to God? Does the sovereign have a duty to God? Well, and the answer to both of these questions, because the sovereign itself is the judge, then practically the answer is no. The answer is no. The sovereign is not bound by anything. Okay? Like the answer theoretically is yes, but practically no. So theoretically the answer is yes. The sovereign is bound, but practically, because the sovereign itself is the judge, practically the answer is no. Okay? Okay. So Hobbes continues. He says that, some people may say that, this is too subtle a deduction, it's difficult to understand what these laws of nature are. And he says, people are too busy in getting food, or maybe people are too negligent to understand, right? Hobbes says, this is no excuse. This is no excuse, because there's one easy sum, intelligible even to the meanest capacity. So basically, Hobbes is saying everybody can understand the laws of nature. He says, do not that to another which you would not have done to yourself. Right? So this is basically the silver rule. Okay. Anyway. So we're almost done with the laws of nature, but let's continue, right? So finally we get to this. This is a subtitle. It's not exactly part of the text, so I'm not sure. But are these Hobbes' own words? Maybe they are, right? The laws of nature oblige in conscience always, but in effect only when there is security. These are important words that we have to keep in mind. In effect only when there is security. The laws of nature oblige in conscience always, but in effect only there is insecurity. The laws of nature oblige in foro internal, that is, they bind to a desire that they should take place. You must always want to keep the laws of nature. But in foro external, that is to putting them in act, not always. But you shouldn't always keep them. Right? So you must always want to keep them, but you shouldn't always actually keep them. For he that should be modest and tractable and perform all he promises in such a time and place where no man else should do. So basically, again, we're talking about reciprocity, or security. So again, security which guarantees reciprocity. Right? So he says, he that should be modest and tractable, perform all his promises in such a time where no man else should do so, should by make himself prey to others and procure his own certain ruin. So if you are keeping promises in the state of nature, you are simply destroying yourself, contrary to the grounds of all laws of nature, which tend to preservation. And again, he that having sufficient security that others shall observe the same laws towards him, observes them not himself, seeks not peace but war, and consequently the destruction of his own nature but violence. But if you have sufficient security, then and other people observe the laws to you, and you are not observing them, so the fool, right, seeks not peace, but war, and consequently the destruction of his own nature, violence. And whatsoever laws bind in foro internal may be broken, not only by a fact contrary to law, but a fact according to it, in case a man think it contrary. So again, if you want, upon any reasonable suspicion. So upon any reasonable suspicion. And this is why people call Leviathan Rebels Catechism. Upon your individual intellect decides, individual intellect tells you that upon any reasonable suspicion, the contract is void. Isn't this going to lead to rebellion? Isn't this Rebels Catechism? Important questions, colleagues, for you to consider. So laws of nature are immutable and eternal, for it can never be that war shall preserve life and peace destroy it. So again, but laws of nature are theorems. Yeah. And the science of them is the true and only moral philosophy. So the science of these laws of nature. Moral philosophy is nothing else but the science of what is good and evil in the conversation and society of mankind. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers and customs, doctrines of men are different, and diverse men differ not only in their judgment on the senses of what is pleasant and unpleasant, but also in what is conformable or disagreeable to reason. So, but also people disagree. Men disagree as to what is conformable or disagreeable to reason. The same man in diverse times differ from themselves. So people disagree with themselves. A person can even disagree with him or herself. Right. So I cannot agree with myself. I today cannot agree with myself tomorrow. So at one time I praise what is called good, and one time dispraise called evil. Right. So we have disputes, controversies, and at last war. And therefore, so long as a man in the condition of mere nature, which is the condition of war, has a private appetite, the private appetite is a measure of good and evil, and consequently all men agree on this. But all men can agree on this, right? That peace is good. So we are all different, but one thing is the same. So all different, but one thing the same, right? All men agree that peace is good, and therefore also that the way and means of peace, which I have shown before, are justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature are good. That is to say, moral virtues and their contrary vices evil. But the writers of moral philosophy are inconsistent and have not understood this before. So Hobbes says that the science of moral philosophy is as old as his book Leviathan. Is only as old as his book Leviathan. And now finally, let's talk about this. This is Taylor Warrender. We're almost done with this. Taylor Warrender, right? These dictates of reason men used to call by the name laws, but improperly. For they are not laws, right? Not laws, but conclusions, merely conclusions or theorems concerning what conduces to the conservation and defense of people. Whereas law, properly, is the word of him that by right has command over others. So far so good. Now we get to Taylor Warrender, right? But yet, if, and I want to triple underline this, it's kind of interesting. If we consider the same theorems as delivered in the Word of God, then they are properly called laws. And, basically the standard interpretation is that they're not really laws. But, like whatever floats your boat. If you believe in God, call them laws. But if you want, for example, you believe in God, call them laws. Call them laws. Feel free to call them laws. Like whatever floats your boat, man. Right? This is the standard interpretation. But Taylor Warrender want to latch on to this if Taylor Warrender say no. There is a God, and therefore laws of nature are really laws. Well, I have to tell you, my own personal interpretation is that I don't find Taylor Warrender to be convincing, but you should be aware, and this is an interesting contrast. Oops. Okay, we've been going on for quite some time, so I think maybe we can take a break here. But this is a super important question, laws of nature. And we have gone through all of them. We have talked about the fool's problem, and especially about Taylor Warrender. So I hope that you will have taken this to heart. These are, somewhat technical issues, but I think they are comprehensible. So, and I do hope that this is now clear in your minds. However, if you do have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. So, colleagues, as always, let's take a break. And until next time, stay safe and take care.